The weekly Cybercrime and Business podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everyone out there, today is Friday, June 5th. I'm here with the Surfwatch Labs team. I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, here with Surfwatch Labs writer Matt Leifus and Surfwatch Labs data analyst Eric Severson. A little bit later, after our discussion and latest news, we have an interview with Nathan Wenzler. He's the senior technology evangelist at Thycotic Software, and we talk about Edward Snowden since today is the 2-year anniversary of the Snowden leaks, so we just chat about that and kind of what that means in the past couple years. But yeah, dive right into the top stories of the week. Throw it over to you, Matt.
Sure, and coming in, the third top story this week, according to Surfwatch Labs data, was U.S. HealthWorks. The company suffered a potential data breach after an employee's laptop was compromised. It was stolen out of his car. Big story here was that, yes, the laptop was stolen, but it was also unencrypted. So the data, if the criminals were able to bypass the password lock on the computer, they could pretty easily get to the data. The potentially affected victims of this were the 3,000 employees, actually it was a little more than 3,000 employees of the company at U.S. HealthWorks. The company sent a letter to their employees telling them about the situation. At this time, it's unclear how many of those employees are affected or what data was in there. Coming in number 2, we have Woolworths. This is an Australian grocery store chain. The company made headlines this week after a huge mistake by an employee was made. Several customers of the grocery chain purchased gift cards off of Groupon. They were $100 and $200 gift cards at a discount. They were informed that they would receive this coupon depending on what they purchased through email. Instead of getting a voucher for the $100 or $200 gift card, the 1,000+ purchasers of these Groupon gift cards received a master list of all available gift card vouchers for the store. So we're talking about 8,000 different redeemable codes. The grand total was like over $1 million worth of merchandise. After the event, the store obviously canceled the vouchers. One of the big deals from this event was that potentially some email addresses were compromised, and on top of that, unauthorized users were able to use these codes to purchase, a bunch of stuff. It was a real mess. And number 1 this week, we had Heartland Payment Systems. The payment processor company notified California's Attorney General about a data breach at their Santa Ana, California location. The breach occurred after several password-protected computers were stolen from this office. The company does not yet know how many people could be affected or what information was obtained. As many of you know, this isn't the first time that Heartland Payment Systems has been in the news about a data breach. In 2008, the company was involved in one of the largest breaches on record, where over 100 million debit and credit cards were stolen, and it cost the company about $32 million. Those were the top 3 stories of the week.
Yeah, Matt, so I saw this week that you posted a lot of the industry report cards from Surfwatch Labs on the site. And the one that stood out to me, I know last week we talked a lot about the healthcare sector, but what stood out to me this week looking at those was the government sector. Of all the report cards, government actually got the worst grade in the month of May. It got a D+ based on Surfwatch Labs' overall risk score. And what that means with the grading, a C is sort of the average risk that's suspected in the sector. So that means that the government is seeing increased risk that month. And so I just dove in and I was looking at some of the data from Surfwatch Labs. In May, there was 107 distinct industry targets tied to cybercrime in the government sector. And this was down a little bit from April. April had 126. February only had 58 targets. March had 90. So the 107 in May is still above average. But on top of that, the targeted asset score rose for the sector. And this is likely due to all the stuff at the IRS. Obviously they're targeting social security numbers, identity information, things like that, which is much more serious than, all the ISIS web defacements or Op Israel web defacements. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then there was also a couple other government-related stories that popped up just in the past week. Reuters, they reported that the United States tried to deploy a version of the Stuxnet computer virus to attack North Korea 5 years ago, in tandem with the one that targeted Iran's nuclear weapon program. According to a U.S. intelligence source, the Stuxnet's developers produced a related virus that would be activated when it encountered Korean language settings on an infected machine. According to the report, this makes North Korea, along with Iran, the only known countries that U.S. cyber espionage campaigns have targeted with software designed to destroy equipment.
I think it's most interesting that the attack on North Korea failed. It was really quite a remarkable attack against Iran and did quite a bit of damage, but North Korea seems to have weathered it pretty well, and interesting that Iran is typically viewed as more of the cyber threat, but they were hit much harder by Stuxnet.
Another interesting story that just came across my feed has to do with ISIS. We've talked a lot about on the podcast about how ISIS has really used social media to their advantage. You know, they've built up a following, they've done a lot of defacements kind of to spread their word. But according to this story, one ISIS member took a selfie of himself outside of a building, put it on social media, and then the U.S. Air Force later bombed that building after discovering where it was. Air Force General Hawk Carlyle, he said that the building was destroyed by 3 Joint Direct Attack Munition missiles less than 24 hours after the intelligence team at Hurlburt Field, Florida, saw the photo on social media. He said that basically the team was working down there, they're combing through social media looking for stuff, and, quote, they see some moron standing at this command. So just kind of thought that was interesting to point out the flip side of all this social media and hacktivists and, and cyber warfare sort of using it to promote yourself. In this case, it backfired. This guy took a photo, posted on social media, and that led to this building getting destroyed. So maybe an extreme case, but once again, the dangers of social media for some organizations. Like I said, there's a lot of activity in the government sector. I think on the flip side, the consumer goods actually had the best grade for the month, right, Matt?
It was definitely one of them, and mildly surprising, considering last year all you really heard about was consumer goods this and consumer goods that. One of the biggest ones was like the Home Depot, and so you've heard a lot about it. This year, however, like for instance, this month we had Sally Beauty Holdings, and then there was something with the Washington Post. But so far this year, considering, yes, targets are appearing and they're showing up in SurfWatch data, it definitely hasn't been as impactful this year as compared to last year. And another thing that really surprised me is how much malware is turning up in discussion. Last year, the big one obviously was, malware being used in POS, point of sale breaches, and it is being discussed this year, but not nearly, again, as much. In March, malware appeared in 32.3% of the sector's cyberfax, but in April and May, it's dipped down to less than 10%. So a little surprised.
I'm not sure if it's that these consumer goods, like mostly retailers, have started to get their act together, or if it's people moving on to other targets. The chip and pin stuff is starting to come into effect. There's more, a little more awareness, a little more focus, a little more attention and security. So maybe the stores are actually just doing better, or maybe we'll see another footfall in a month or two. We'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the people we spoke to about chip and pin had predicted that there was going to be this big surge before everything was implemented, trying to sort of clean up, the easy stuff while they can. But we just really haven't seen a whole lot of that this year. I mean, there's been a few instances. But yeah, I do wonder if this is, like I know we interviewed Cyan Gonen from Gemalto a while back, and he was talking about how their breach index report saw a lot of shift towards ID theft versus credit card theft, and we've seen some other studies with medical ID theft. So a lot of people have been predicting this shift towards ID theft, and I wonder if, these attacks in our data is just kind of reflecting that, or if, as the other people have been saying, we might actually see a a quick surge in consumer goods point of sale theft before this chip and pin stuff gets implemented. Yeah, I guess the other big news this week that on the political side of things was the USA Freedom Act was signed into law. I don't know if either of you guys have been following that really and kind of what that means for the cybersecurity community.
Obviously, with anytime you have some type of law or legislation signed, there's a lot of underlining things that you got to really kind of go over with a fine-tooth comb to get to. But the main thing to take from this that I see is that it's going to take away the NSA's ability to collect phone data that they've been doing for years and years. However, it's important to point out that this data is still going to be collected, but it's going to be more on the telephone providers. I did see an article today, though, that said that immediately the NSA had to turn over the data that they had. So you're talking, all of this data they've collected for years. They had to turn that over to the phone companies. However, for the next 6 months, the NSA can still attempt to collect this data. It's some weird provision in the legislation. As of right now, the NSA lawfully has to stop collecting this data in December of this year. Like I said, there's obviously a lot of more things with it, but to me, that was the biggest takeaway.
It's not too surprising that some of the civil rights groups sort of dropped their support of the Freedom Act as it was amended over time. And of course, the big things are what this act doesn't address. It talks about phone metadata, but we know a lot about what they're doing online, what they're doing with certain hardware, and what they were doing with the tailored access operations where they were, messing with routers and then repackaging them before they were delivered to a business. There's a lot internet-wise going on with the NSA that this act doesn't touch.
If you want to know more about some of the stuff that's been going on with the NSA and Snowden and how it affects the cyber community, just stay tuned for our interview with Nathan Wenzler from Thycotic, which will be coming up in just a moment. But first, we have our cyber tip of the week. One of the interesting things that I saw in a report this week was the Anti-Phishing Working Group. They put out their report kind of updating on the various phishing practices of the second half of 2014. And one of the things buried in the report that I thought was kind of interesting is they said that the use of these URL shortening services like tinyURL and Bitly, the use of them increased in the second half of 2014. They actually nearly doubled from the 1,696 attacks in the first half of 2014 to 3,072 in the second half of 2014. That still only represents about 2.5% of all the phishing attacks, so it's not like a widespread, rampant problem. But the people who wrote the paper, they just said that they said it was of note because previously there'd been a lot of work in this space to eliminate such attacks, and that this continued increase may be pointing towards newly exploited flaws in the shortening service's defense or perhaps lower diligence. So just something to think about when you're out there clicking on all these shortened links you see on social media and other places is that 2.5% of all phishing attacks from the second half of 2014 were actually using those URL shorteners. All right, now coming up, we have an interview with Nathan Wenzler, Senior Technology Evangelist at Thycotic. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was, it's been 2 years to the day since the NSA leaks by Edward Snowden made news. And I know that Thycotic did a Snowden-related survey at RSA this year. So I was just wondering to get some feedback on that, kind of in general, what the tech community feels about Snowden now that initial hoopla has died down and it's been a couple of years.
Well, sure. I think that there's still a pretty strong sense in the community that what Snowden revealed, at least from a content perspective, is not necessarily a surprise. I think everyone sort of suspected, but this was a lot of evidence that supported that. And I don't think the sense of the level of surveillance or what the government's been doing has changed necessarily. I think that some people have calmed down a little bit of the rhetoric that was initially surrounding, Snowden leaving the country and all of that kind of thing. So I don't know if we've yet gotten to a point where they look at it as sort of a legitimate whistleblower kind of situation and might welcome it back to the community with open arms. But I think that a lot of folks have sort of paired that knowledge of, we always suspected the government was doing this, now we kind of know, with the fact that, the guy was trying to do essentially what he thought was the right thing. And it isn't quite the sensationalism kind of thing that I think a lot of people made it out to be in the first couple of months. So there's definitely a mellowing, I think, of the community, but there's still a lot of the same sentiment about the level of surveillance and all of that.
There was one stat that came out, I believe it was in 2013, just a couple months after the Snowden revelations began. But I think it was Forrester Research's James Statton. He predicted that the revelations could cost U.S. tech companies as much as $180 billion. I think that number might be a little inflated, but in your guys' survey at RSA, it said that attendees feel that the NSA's surveillance of U.S. citizens has increased or remained the same since the Snowden leaks. 94% of them felt that way. So just wondering your thought on how these revelations are impacting, or if they still are impacting tech businesses, given that the consensus is that things really haven't dialed back at all in terms of surveillance.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So admittedly, I did not read that specific Forrester report, but I would speculate that a lot of it was driven around either, the potential for having to defend against attacks from foreign nation states or that kind of thing, because now this stuff's out in the clear and so everyone's going to be looking for blood, or, bolstering the defenses internally to try to prevent the government from surveilling them, or even maybe conversely, the flip side of it is just the data breach kind of aspect of it, that now that we know there's surveillance going on, customers get angry, that type of thing. And I agree with you. I think that the number, even from a couple of years ago, was pretty inflated. But I would, on the flip side, say that there's probably a very reasonable cost that is going to be associated with this, especially with the passing of the Freedom Act here now just a couple of days ago, where they're going to put more of the impetus on the companies, a requirement on the companies, especially telcos, to hold on to this data for the government's purposes should they ever need it or request it. And now you're going to start incurring costs for infrastructure and people to manage it, and the ability to secure it and the ability to search for it, and all this kind of thing to respond to any kind of government inquiry that may come in. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, no one could have predicted 2 years ago that was where the government was going to go with this whole thing when it was all said and done. But it's definitely going to be a cost factor now that companies that are involved in these kinds of any kind of ISP or telco or anything like that, they're all going to have to now respond and deal with this. So, yeah, $180 billion because of data breaches and the surveillance piece, I think that's overinflated. $180 billion, though, to start building new infrastructure to store a bunch of information that the government may want at some point in time, that could get up there, depending on the scope of what needs to be stored and how long the government actually requires these guys to hold on to the data. That could get really costly in the long run. So it will be interesting to see what ends up happening with that one way or the other. But I think that's there definitely is going to be a cost factor at this point. Now that we're 2 years down the road.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about privileged account management, because there's a lot of articles that came out, after the Snowden leaks. I think a lot of people, especially outside the tech community, were pretty astounded that basically a guy could just walk into the security agency and just steal millions of documents and no one even noticed. And I believe it was in 2014 that the director of national intelligence, James Clapper, he said that our whole system is based on personal trust, which works great unless you have a malicious insider. So just wondering, with these 2 years to reflect, are there any lessons to be learned, or has the community improved on that front in the past couple of years?
Yeah, this is one of those areas that I will tell you, for me, is a sort of personal interest. My background in security I've done kind of a little bit of everything. I tend to focus on more the people side of security, so processes and workflow and that whole piece of it, social engineering, that kind of thing. And for years, you always hear the statement about trust but verify. That was always a good running mantra for a lot of people. And I don't hear that as much anymore. which is kind of interesting to me because it reflects a little bit of this change, just like we're seeing here. This whole system is based on personal trust. When you do the verification for trusted people, it's going to verify out just fine. And you're still left with the same problem of essentially hoping that nothing goes wrong. And I think the change is starting to happen. Especially in the privilege account management industry, you're seeing a lot more people, a lot of companies getting on board. They're finally figuring out that you can't just trust. You have to actually take control and do something about the credentials that can have all the access to all the data and keys to the kingdom kind of scenarios. So there's definitely a lot more awareness and I think a lot more involvement in IT and security organizations that people are starting to, either buy solutions or they're doing something to limit the amount of privileged accounts they have in their systems to get away from this idea that just because I've hired somebody who is an IT professional, that means by default I can give them, all the crown jewels and everything will be fine. It's taking sort of the personal aspect out of it a little bit and trying to be reasonable about how we protect from the risk of these accounts getting abused. So we're seeing this pop up everywhere. I mean, I actually just read Ponemon Institute just recently did a healthcare survey, and you see the same kind of thing in healthcare. There's a lot of concern about employee negligence, but at the same time, the places where they're having the biggest problems with data breaches are criminal attacks and people abusing privileged accounts. So there's a big change happening. I think the industry is starting to get on board with this, and I would bet you the next couple of years we're going to see a big uptick in this kind of thing, just because it's finally getting out on the table that, yes, we can't just sit back and do nothing anymore. We actually have to take control, manage these kinds of situations, manage these accounts, and go forward from there. So it's a pretty profound change, I think, from a philosophy perspective and security side of things, but it's one that's been a long time coming, and I think that everyone's coming around to the notion pretty quickly. So that's actually a pretty heartening kind of thing to see in the industry, that people are jumping on board and just doing it. So it's good. It's a good change.
One other thing that comes to mind when I think of, Snowden the NSA just these last couple of years is there's been a lot of talk among businesses about privacy. I guess you could argue that there's still a significant number of consumers who don't seem to care about their privacy, but there's definitely a segment that does. So just wondering if there's any advice you have for businesses out there that are dealing with these privacy concerns that seem to be increasing.
Yeah, I think businesses today have kind of a tough line to walk. You've got compliance and regulation that you have to adhere to, and people in general, your customers and those folks out there, I'm actually really glad you said this, because no one seems to care about their private information until something bad happens to it, right? It's not worried if my credit card numbers get lost. I don't care if someone gets a driver's license in my name. That's all fine until the loan bills start coming in or their accounts get wiped out or whatever the case is. And suddenly now it's a big problem. So it's a tough line for businesses. They've got a whole giant customer base that basically doesn't care to some extent. And then when it all goes wrong, they do care. And then you have loss of reputation, you've got financial losses, and so on and so forth. So most companies that I ever talk to about this, my advice to them always is to take it far more seriously than either the government or your customer base, at least on the surface, seems to be taking it. Because when it all comes down, should that data get out or should something really bad happen, you're going to have one or both of those sides of the equation will come back after you as the holder of that information. So it's really important. I think most companies get that. That's the beauty of a good risk management program, is that people are starting to become very, very, very aware of how important that is. So, don't let your customers and don't let the government or whatever the regulatory body is necessarily drive what the right thing to do is. As a business, you need to be able to figure out what you have, what information are you holding, and protect it in a way that essentially manages the risk down to that worst case scenario of we've lost everything and now we've got a lot of angry people. What do we do? If you can address those kinds of situations, you're going to be much better off from a privacy standpoint going forward.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Nathan. I appreciate it.
Great. Not a problem, Jeff. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to this week's Cybercrime and Business podcast. As always, you can follow us on iTunes, YouTube, and Podbean. And now we're on Stitcher and SoundCloud, as well as a few other sites. For more information, check out surfwatchlabs.com.